Hello, I'm Diana Reif, the Artistic Director of the Charleston Literary Festival. I'd like to welcome our speakers, audience, and donors. If the past 4 to 18 months has taught us anything, it is that books and their authors, whether classical or contemporary, really matter. In trying times, readers turn to books for insights into the human condition, for the opportunity to be transported to other worlds, for ideas, for arguments, for inspiration, for experiencing the impossible, for laughter, and for the release of tears. The festival will provide the opportunity to engage with a galaxy of literary and artistic stars, as well as up-and-coming writers who are making waves. We have a far-flung cast list featuring authors from all over the United States, as well as the United Kingdom and elsewhere. Whether they're talking about former literary trailblazers, or gene editing, or human rights, or popular culture, or feminism, or medieval nuns, or groundbreaking films, or innumerable other subjects, they have one thing in common: the ability of compelling stories to linger in our imaginations. We're grateful to all our speakers, whether virtual or in person, for sharing their talents. Please thank them by purchasing their books. The festival couldn't happen without a committed team and board. We would like to thank our donors, both private and public, who generously make the festival possible. The College of Charleston, our academic partner, has been an invaluable source of support. It is no accident that the festival takes place in Charleston, a prime destination with a progressive literary and artistic tradition. I hope that you enjoy all the events and that they make you think and dream afresh. Good afternoon, everyone. And it's my privilege to introduce Professor Louis Menand and his interlocutor, Geoffrey Harpham. Louis Menand is the Distinguished Professor of English at Harvard University and a staff writer at The New Yorker. His books include The Metaphysical Club, published in 2001, which won the Pulitzer Prize in History and the Francis Parkman Prize from the Society of American Historians. In 2016, he was awarded the National Humanities Level by President Barack Obama. Geoffrey Harpham is Senior Fellow at Duke University and former President of the National Humanities Center in Chapel Hill, where Louis Menand served on the board. Geoffrey is the author of the forthcoming Citizenship on Catfish Row, Race and Nation in American Culture. They've come here this evening to discuss Louis Menand's most recent publication, very recent as it happens, The Free World, a follow-up to The Metaphysical Club. The New York Times stated, "The free world sparkles, fully original, beautifully written. It covers the interchange of arts and ideas between the United States and Europe in the decades following World War II. So, expect to see an interchange of ideas on the platform this afternoon."
Okay, Luke, the book is called The Free World, Art and Thought in the Cold War. It's a substantial volume. For those of you who have not yet bought it, you'll have your opportunity to do so after we talk today. I know it took you 10 years to write, at least, yeah. But I would suspect the actual figure is more like 20 or 30. But tell us about the book. What's it about?
Yeah. First of all, I just want to say thank you to the organizers of the festival for having me come down, and my friend Geoffrey for agreeing to be my interlocutor, and to all of you for coming out on this beautiful evening. I'm going to try to describe the book quickly so we can get into some of the stories that I tell in the book, but it covers the period from the end of the Second World War, 1945, to 1965, which is the year that the United States sent the Marines to Vietnam and began bombing North Vietnam, the beginning of the Vietnam War. And when I started writing the book, which was about 10 years ago, I didn't have a very preconceived idea of what the story would look like as I was telling it. And as I went along, I began to get a clearer and clearer picture of why this period was important. I think it was important because in 1945, or shortly after the war, the United States was viewed by other countries as a benevolent political and military power because it had led the fight against fascism, and then it had helped to rebuild Western Europe and Japan. But it was regarded as culturally a peripheral player in world culture. People liked American movies, they liked jazz, but they didn't think of the United States as a center of civilization in the way that people thought of Paris, for example. By 1965, this is completely flipped. The United States had burned through the political capital that had accumulated by fighting fascism and rebuilding Western Europe and Japan, but it had moved to the center of an increasingly global world of culture. And that's the trajectory that my book tries to describe.
Right, and a fantastic trajectory and a very, very long one. It is. The free world is actually about two free worlds, isn't it? I mean, there's the European, Paris and London, but especially Paris, form of freedom, and then there's the American form of freedom. Do you distinguish between those?
I don't really in the book. I think one thing that I figured out pretty quickly as I was writing it was that an important way of understanding American culture in this period is to understand the international influences on American culture, particularly Europeans who came here either in the 1930s with the rise of Hitler or after the war, and then the influence of ideas and art from France, from England, and from other countries, including India and Japan. It's a very global picture, actually, the cultural development in this period. It tends to center in the United States ultimately, but it really comes from everywhere. So I generally treated the liberal democracies, that is, say, France, the UK, and the US, as basically standing for the same idea of freedom, because that was our slogan in the Cold War with the Soviet Union, because we wanted to say that we don't tell writers what to write. The state doesn't tell painters what to paint. The state doesn't prescribe a certain style of music, but they do that in the Soviet Union. And if you don't adhere to that style in the Soviet Union, you'll be censored, and your work won't be shown. So this was the propaganda pitch that the liberal democracy sent out, and they were all on board with that.
Right. You mentioned at one point that you never really settled what freedom is, which I imagine is very, very useful for you, because if you had, then you'd be dealing with a much more constricted framework. I wonder if it's fair, you spent some time talking about Isaiah Berlin, and we'll get to him a little later, but he's the author of an essay called Two Concepts of Liberty. And the two concepts are freedom from and freedom to. Is it fair to say that in the European setting, post-war, they experienced freedom from, that is, the ravages of war, and that in America, they experienced freedom to do things, freedom to explore?
Yeah, I think I wouldn't put, that's a good point, but I think I wouldn't put the distinction quite that way. So this is an essay by the British philosopher, who's actually a Russian emigre, Isaiah Berlin, published in 1958. It's called Two Concepts of Liberty. It's kind of a famous piece, and he does distinguish two kinds of liberty or two kinds of freedom, freedom from and freedom to, or freedom for. And the idea is that the purest form of freedom is freedom from. That's don't tread on me freedom. That's I don't want to wear a mask freedom, okay? That's saying I don't want anybody telling me what to do, no matter if it's for my own good or not. I want to be able to make my own choices. Freedom to, or freedom for, is freedom in order to achieve some other social good, let's say equality. So on Berlin's account, equality and liberty are incommensurable goods. If you give people more freedom, you'll have less equality, and if you give people more equality, you'll have less freedom. And that clearly was meant to map on to the Cold War geopolitical situation in which the socialist country, Soviet Union, stood for equality, and the capitalist democracies stood for liberty in the form of freedom from. And Berlin was clearly in favor of the freedom from version of it, of the don't tread on me version of it. So that's very important, and it's very important in Europe because, as Geoffrey was suggesting, for European intellectuals, let's say Jean-Paul Sartre, he was against the United States because he was against that kind of freedom. He was against capitalism. He believed in socialism. He wanted equality. So part of what the sort of ideological part of the Cold War was for the United States to convince people like Jean-Paul Sartre or other European intellectuals that freedom from was better, or the American version of freedom was better than the Soviet version of equality.
Yeah. You know, one thing that's so strong reading your book is that during the period that you're talking about, the late 40s, 50s, and 60s, people cared passionately about movies and music and books, and there was an intensity about the cultural activity of the time, which I suspect you would account for by saying that these were seen as the flowers of freedom, and so they had an importance beyond themselves.
Exactly.
Is that fair?
Yeah, so that's exactly right. You really are struck by the way in which people really care about poetry, really care about painting, really care about music, and get into these huge debates about whether Jackson Pollock's paintings, the drip paintings, are art or not, or big debate about whether rock and roll is good for you or not. I mean, people really cared about that. And it's very contrastive with today, where we're extremely tolerant of all kinds of cultural styles and forms, and if we don't like it, we just ignore it because there's tons of other product out there for us. But in the 50s and 60s, people were really invested in it. And Geoffrey suggests what the reason was, because if, let's say your message is, the United States message is, we're the free world, you can come here and paint any way you want. The state is not going to tell you how to paint. You can paint a soup can, an American flag, a drip painting, whatever. Let's say then that the art that gets produced under that regime isn't very good. Let's say the drip painting isn't really art. That's a problem. So you have to be able to defend that, because you're actually defending a whole ideological superstructure that goes along with it. It's the evidence that the free way of doing things is the better way of doing things.
I think it's Kundera, Milan Kundera, the Eastern European writer, said that in a Stalinist regime, nothing goes, and so everything counts, whereas in Western regime, everything goes, and so nothing counts.
Yeah, he was a little cynical about that, but I think it's not true of this period. It becomes true after this period.
Yeah. Is it fair to say then that if these things, the movies and music and painting, no longer have that kind of hypercharged quality for us, that it's because they no longer carry the weight of this philosophically and politically precious concept of freedom? Or would you say that we don't care about freedom as much?
I think we care about freedom, but I think that we don't think that political questions turn on the particular cultural style that you like. We think culture has other importance to us, mostly having to do with questions of identity, who's representing whom, and so forth. That's, people get into fights about art all the time, but it's a different kind of fight. The way I put it would be to say that in 1945, the world had been through a Great Depression that lasted 10 years, and then it had been through a World War that lasted 6 years. I mean, that was a terrible period in world history, and people wanted to turn the page. The Germans called 1945 Zero Hour. Of course, the Germans had a very good reason to want to turn the page, 1945. But everybody had this sense that we can start over, because for the first time in almost 20 years or 15 years, we have peace and prosperity. It's actually a period of enormous economic growth around the world. There's just, the pie keeps growing. So people could ask themselves, well, what if I put a canvas on the floor of my studio and throw paint on it? Would that be a painting? Or people could ask themselves, well, suppose I composed a piece that lasted 4 minutes and 33 seconds in which the performer didn't play a single note, John Cage. Suppose they asked themselves, well, suppose I painted big panels of painting, of canvas with white house paint and nothing else. Would that be a painting? So people were asking questions about what is art? What is music? What is cinema? That's what they debated. Those are questions we don't ask today. We don't say, is this cinema? Is this art? It's all art, right? We're accustomed to that. But this period, they actually cared about that. What's interesting about the period from the point of view of the Cold War is that most of the art is not very political, actually. Most of the art's about art. It's very art for art's sake period, when people are thinking about the nature of artistic production. So it's fascinating to go back there, because it's so different from our own time.
When I asked if we still care about freedom, you actually laughed at that as though, of course we still care about freedom. I'm not so sure, and I'd like to get you to talk about that. Right. Does freedom have the same power as a concept? Does it have the same value that it had in the period that you're talking about?
For how many of you is freedom important? Yeah, I've seen a lot of hands out there, Geoffrey. Yeah. I'll put it this way.
Not an answer.
No, it is an answer. These are the people, man. I put it this way. In the 50s and 60s, everybody uses the term freedom. For example, 1963, Martin Luther King gives the I Have a Dream speech. He uses the word liberty or freedom 20 times in that speech. Yeah. He used the word equality once. Okay? That same year, January 1963, George Wallace is inaugurated as governor of Alabama and gives his segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever speech. He uses the freedom all the time, word freedom all the time in that speech. Now, what Martin Luther King wanted freedom from was Jim Crow laws in the South, and what George Wallace wanted freedom from was the Supreme Court and the federal government and federal overreach. They're They had different things they wanted freedom from, but they both used the term constantly. Nevertheless, I would say, on balance, freedom tends to be a kind of liberal or left-wing slogan in the 50s and 60s. Freedom of speech, for example, is very important. Today, it's more of a right-wing slogan. So today, it is, I wasn't just joking by the freedom not to wear a mask. That's an example of a kind of right-wing appropriation of the motto of freedom. And it's less of a left-wing or progressive value today, because that's all about social justice and equality. So that's an interesting difference from this earlier period.
Are you saying that social justice and equality are inconsistent with freedom?
I don't think they are, no. Yeah. But some people do, because some people think that individual liberties get in the way of our ability as a society to redress inequality. Yeah. Some people do think that. I think that's not a good thing to think. We have to be able to think that my freedom, my feeling of liberty, which is important to me, I mean, it's always been important to me, as a kid, it was very important to me. That feeling that I have is not incompatible with making life better for other people who have less freedom. We have to be able to feel that. Otherwise, we're facing a dilemma that we don't need to face.
Yeah. Sorry to dwell on this, but it's such an interesting subject. Are you suggesting that the freedom that people value today is primarily individual freedom rather than collective freedom?
Yeah, I think it is. Yeah. What do you mean by collective freedom, though?
What am I what?
Mean by collective freedom. What do you mean by that?
What?
Collective freedom.
Collective freedom?
Yeah.
Well, collective freedom is democracy. Oh. Collective freedom is, a free society.
Yeah.
I'm accustomed to thinking of free society.
Yeah.
But if we think about individual freedom, that
Yeah.
can actually conflict with the idea of a free society.
It can, yeah. But I would think that most people want to see the freedoms instantiated in political institutions, so that the Bill of Rights is being respected, and that courts are enforcing it, and so the government is following it. I think Americans do think that their individual sense of freedom is reflected in the Constitution. Yeah. They differ about what the Constitution says about the freedom, but they think that the great thing about living here is that we have a written document that expresses our notions of what counts as fundamental freedoms.
Yeah. Your book is so detailed and it's so filled with commotion that it's easy to get the sense there's really no driving force, no zeitgeist, no world spirit, no kind of throbbing pulse that regulates these individual activities.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you intended to create a picture of kind of an insect swarm with this infinite diversity and plenitude of swarm, or is there some secret rhythm that regulates all of this that's not exactly articulated in your book?
Yeah, I don't believe in the zeitgeist. It doesn't work that way. I believe in individual people trying to make things and try to figure out how they did it, why they did it, what they meant by it.
But when you say that, don't you miss some possibility of abstraction that might simplify and clarify the
I don't want to simplify it. I want to complexify it.
Why?
Because I want to show, so when you're flying in an airplane at 30,000 feet and you look down at, let's say, the Rocky Mountains or something, you sort of see a pattern that, in the geology from a great height. And a lot of cultural history is written at that height. So it's tracing all these patterns. Well, here are all these people who look different, but actually share some kind of common zeitgeisty thing. Okay. But when you're in the mountains, the Rocky Mountains, it's chaos. You have no idea what the pattern is. You can't see a pattern. That's what it's like to be an artist. That's what it's like to be a writer. You don't know where things are going. You just kind of take a shot at it and hope that it works out. Let's go back to Jackson Pollock for a second, because he's pretty emblematic of this. So the story is that Jackson Pollock comes to New York from LA. He's from LA, went to high school there, or from California, and he wants to be a painter. And he's very ambitious, but he's very unlucky. It's not a great period for American painters, because not a lot of galleries want to show American art, blah, 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 but he's also struggling to find a style. And then he marries Lee Krasner, who's also an important abstract painter, and they move to Springs, which is a place on Long Island in the Hamptons, back at a time when you could afford to live in the Hamptons, 1946. And he has this little house, and there's a barn on the property that's kind of run down. And they're in the house, they're trying to paint, and he's into now making these big mural-sized paintings. And he doesn't have a wall that's big enough in the house to stretch a canvas on it. So he puts the canvas on the floor, and he takes a can of paint, he puts a stick in it, and then he throws the paint on the canvas. And he finds that because it's on the floor, he can walk around the canvas and have access to it in a way that he couldn't have if it was on an easel or if it was on a wall. He likes doing this. So they convert the barn into a studio. He keeps the canvas on the floor, and he continues to throw paint on it. It's 1947. And for the next 3.5 years, he makes this incredible body of work. It's just the most beautiful body of work in painting.
And hard to imitate.
It's very difficult. You think, oh, my kid could do that. You can't do that. It's really hard to do. When you're in a museum looking at a Pollock, go very close to it. It's just uncanny how he's able to interlace these colors. It's astonishing stuff. So he makes this incredible body of work, and then he stops in 1950. Thanksgiving 1950, as kind of starts drinking. He hadn't been drinking for a while, but anyway, he stops painting them. There's just 3.5 years he makes these incredible paintings. How'd that happen? It was an accident. His house was too small. That's it. He wasn't thinking, the paradigm is going this way, I have to do this. No, he wasn't doing that. It just turned out suddenly he makes this incredible body of work that solves all kinds of art world problems that he probably wasn't even thinking about. I'll give you another example, Elvis Presley. So you think Elvis Presley created rock and roll.
Are you going to do
right?
Elvis now?
I'm going to do Elvis in a second. Yeah. Do you mind?
It's not that easy.
No. I'm on a stage, man. So I'm not going to do Elvis. Elvis was living in Memphis. He's from Mississippi, actually, but he moved to Memphis with his family, went to high school there, and he had a fantastic voice, as you know. He's always had a beautiful voice, and he wanted to be a singer, and he would go around playing his guitar, and then one day he goes into this recording studio called Sun Studio, which is in Memphis. Now it's a national landmark or something. And 1954, and he records a song for his mother. And so you could go into the studio, and if you paid them a fee, it was like $4, they'd make a record of you performing. So he sang 2 songs, and they made basically a 45 out of it. And one of the numbers is called My Happiness. You can hear, you just go on Google, you can hear it. It's incredibly beautiful. I mean, it just has an incredible voice. It's just great phrasing. It's just, he's a great artist. And so he sings this song, and which is not rock and roll at all, and somebody writes down next to his name, great ballad singer, or good ballad singer. And then the owner of the studio, a man named Sam Phillips, I think originally from Alabama, and he's running the studio in Memphis, and he comes across a ballad. He wants somebody to sing it. He calls Elvis, brings Elvis in. Elvis tries to sing it. He doesn't like it. It doesn't work out. And then Sam Phillips decides, well, he'll get him together with a couple of musicians. So he calls 2 musicians in, Scotty Moore, who plays electric guitar, and Bill Black, who plays the stand-up bass, and brings Elvis in with them. This is July 1954, and they're in the studio, and they're trying to record a song. They don't care what kind, they just want to record a song. So the first song they try is a Bing Crosby song. It's a crooning song. The second song they try is a country western song, then they try a ballad. Nothing's working. It's hot, they want to go home, and they're ready to quit. And then Elvis grabs the mic. I'm going to do this, actually. And he starts goofing around. He remembers this old rhythm and blues song called That's All Right Mama, recorded by a black artist named Arthur Crudup. And he starts going, that's all right, mama, like this. And then Bill Black and Scotty Moore start joking around, too, and playing with him. And they're just having fun. They're not serious. And Sam Phillips comes out of the control room, and he says, that sounds great. Start from the beginning. That's his first song. That's the first rock and roll song. What happened? It's just that Elvis remembered this rhythm and blues song. He later said he'd never sung rhythm and blues in his entire life. He was no interest in that music. He suddenly sang it. Turns out he's really good at it. Just like Jackson Pollock was really good at throwing paint on the canvas. So that's another case where it doesn't come from the zeitgeist. It just comes from somebody trying something and realizing that, hey, this kind of works.
Well, now that I know that I can get you up out of your chair imitating things, I'm wondering what from your book I can ask you to...
Not Isaiah Berlin.
No. Maybe 4 minutes and 33 seconds you could do that, except that would be dead time here.
I could do that.
You know, some fascinating books are fascinating because of their subjects and what they say and the things you learn from them. But yours is also fascinating in itself for what it is. Yeah. As a writer of books myself, I often try to imagine how some books were made. Yeah. And often I can figure out, often by going to the notes, and we'll get to that in a second, but with your book, I could not imagine how it was done. Yeah. Like how you start, how you organize things, you know, how you lead from one thing into another. At one point you're going from rock and roll. The next chapter is John Kennedy giving his Ich bin ein Berliner speech. Yeah. From there you go to Sir Isaiah Berlin, right. And you wind up at the end of that chapter with paperback books.
That's right, yeah.
And so, Can you give us some insight into your creative process?
I
How
put the
did
paper
you do
on the
this?
floor and I throw words on it. Well, I don't make an outline, and I don't make a draft. I just start with the first sentence. This is anything I write, and I try to see what the next sentence should be, and then I write the next sentence. And that's how I wrote the book. And I knew I wanted to end in 1965 for the reason that I gave you. I could fill that in a little bit more by saying that the book begins with George Kennan, the American diplomat who formulated what's called the policy of containment, which guided American policy towards the Soviet Union for the first 20 years of the Cold War, which was keep the communists in their box. You don't have to drop the bomb on them. You don't have to go to war against them. Just make sure they don't expand, and they'll destroy themselves with their own inefficiency. And that policy, which then guides the American government, despite a lot of rhetoric about liberation and so forth, until 1965, reaches a crisis in Vietnam. Because then the question is, do we have to send the troops to prevent North Vietnam from invading South Vietnam? Is that what the policy of containment calls for? And Kennan was actually called before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee in 1966, and they said to him, is this what you intended, that we would send the Marines? And he couldn't answer it because he didn't know how to answer that question. So that's why I end there. Okay. So all I knew was that was the finish line, over somewhere way over the horizon, and that I just needed to write sentences until I got there. And so I wrote the first chapter on Kennan and the theory of international relations that the policy of containment belongs to, which is called realism. Explain what that is, and talk a little bit about that. And then I finished it, and I thought, well, what should be the next chapter? And I thought I have to write about 1984, because Orwell's novel is probably the most important book about the Cold War in the Cold War. I think it's misunderstood. It was very much misunderstood at the time, but I want to describe what Orwell meant by it, where he got the ideas for it, and the influence that it had. And then I finished that chapter. I thought, what do I have to write about next? I thought existentialism, because that's also post-1945, Sartre, Beauvoir, Camus, they all come on the scene. They become these kind of international celebrities. I want to explain where they got the ideas of existentialism, what they meant by it, blah, blah, blah. And then I started to sort of see what the stepping stones were going to be to get me from 1945 to 1965. So that's how I write. I just try to let the material dictate to me what I need to say and what I need to write about. And I cross my fingers that readers will want to make that journey with me.
Right. Well, that sounds very charming and almost effortless, but I'd like to draw attention.
It's not effortless, man.
It's not effortless. It does sound charming, though.
Yeah, it's charming, but not effortless.
Like all you have to do is write the next sentence. But there's a process involved in getting to the point where you write those sentences. And as a scholar, I found myself drawn to the footnotes. 80 pages, tiny print, double columns. Your book could have been 1,100 pages long if you'd had the footnotes in the same font as the rest of the book.
That's what they told me, yeah.
Yeah. And in these footnotes, you see scholarship of, I'll say, the purest kind, which is to say the dullest kind, the kind when you're actually rooting around in the microbia of history.
Yeah.
And so let me see if I can read these little citations, and you can keep a smile off your face if you can. Testimony before the Foreign Relations Committee. George F. Kennan Diary, Thursday, July 27th, 1934, Box 231, Folder 12. He's already laughing. Kennan Papers. Box 33, Folder, do you remember? Folder 2.
Folder 2,
I know you've been there. Clement Greenberg Papers at the Getty Research Institute. Box 6, Folder 6, that would have to be the Trilling Papers, the Ginsberg Papers, the Richard Wright Papers, the final report of the Select Committee to Study Governmental Operations with respect to intelligence activities, Volume 4, page 31 and page 41.
Yeah.
So while he's writing these sentences, there's something that's
work,
going on before that process.
Yeah. You have to do.
How'd you know that it was Folder 12 in Box 31?
So I looked at it.
Does that mean that you looked at folders 1 through 11 before that, and boxes 1 to 230?
I didn't look at all the folders, no.
Yeah.
I admit, I've never finished the book. You have to, you can't make it up. That's the thing. You have to, you can speculate a little bit about what one of the characters is thinking or something, but basically you have to rely on written material. And a lot of it is archival because That's letters and diaries and so forth tend to give you a little better sense of people. But also there's a lot of interviews. A lot of these people all the people I write about are kind of extremely famous people, so there's tons of interviews about them. There's also a large secondary literature on all of it, which you have to be a little responsible for, so that you're, taking into account what other scholars have written. I had a good fortune to have an office in Widener Library at Harvard, and it's just the most incredible library. I've worked in a lot of good libraries, but it's just unbelievable. And they had everything. And if they didn't have it, of course, they would get it, but they generally had it in their collection on the shelf. One of the things I write about is, which I'm sure we're not going to talk about, is structural anthropology. And one of the figures in that chapter is a man named Roman Jakobson, who was a linguist. And he, for a while, lived in Prague and was part of what's called the Prague Circle of Linguistics in the 1920s, 1930s. And he is supposed to have coined the term structural linguistics in a Czech journal. And my office happens to be in the Slavic periodical section of the Widener Library. I literally walked 5 feet out of my office and it was on the shelf. I could pull the volume off the shelf in Czech and find the article. So that was a great benefit to me because I could do a lot of the work just in the same building. It was really fantastic. But yeah, you have to get down in the weeds, because you have to. What you wanted. So all my chapters are organized around a character or 2 characters, a person, Pollock, Elvis Presley, Roman Jakobson, whoever it is, and I try to create that character for the reader so they feel they know this person, and that's important for me too because I want to feel I understand the person, I understand what makes them tick, so that when they do something, oh yeah, that's what John Cage would do, or that's what Isaiah Berlin would do, or that's what Andy Warhol would do. So I want the reader to feel that too, that they know this person, and therefore they kind of get what the person's particular spin on things is, why they do things the way they do them. And that is a huge way of helping understand what the art's all about.
The reason I draw attention to that is not just to make fun of the scholars' drudge work, but it's so impressive to find that kind of scholarly assiduousness in a writer who typically writes highbrow journalism, New Yorker type journalism, which you don't associate with digging down into box 31, folder 12, bin 6.
Yeah.
Your book is filled with so much. I mean, it's just an unbelievable quantity of stuff that it takes some effort to note what is not in there. But I've compiled a list of things that are either not in there or in there but in a minimal sense.
Okay.
Like they don't get the full treatment.
All right.
Jazz, TV, Broadway, it's not even in the index.
No.
Popular films other than Bonnie and Clyde.
There's a whole thing on films.
Walt Disney, Stan Lee, Mad Magazine, folk music, Chuck Berry,
Mad
Lenny Bruce.
Magazine's in there.
Yeah, okay. I'll give you that. Miles Davis, John Coltrane. What other than finitude, what governed your choices, and any regrets about what got left out?
Finitude. I mean, really, it's 18 chapters. Each chapter is a different person or a bunch of people and a different set of ideas or a different kind of art, abstract expressionism, pop art, British pop art, structuralism, and so forth. I could have written 18 more chapters. I mean, I wouldn't have lived long enough to finish them, but they're easily 18 more subjects. So of the things you mentioned, I think jazz is one of the obvious lacunae because it was very important at the time. People debated it a lot. Obviously, there are questions about race that are mixed up in that debate. So I talk about popular music, which also has racial questions mixed up with it, but not about jazz, only in passing. One thing I wanted to write was a chapter on Japan because there's a lot of interesting art in Japan in the 50s. So of course, what happened with Japan was it was really wiped out in the war, not just by the atomic bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but by all the firebombing of Japanese cities that preceded that, just wiped out the country. They lost most of their infrastructure. So the United States comes in to rebuild it. They bring a lot of American products along with them, and they're, of course, establishing military bases there as well. So there's a lot of GIs with a lot of comic books and all kinds of stuff, and the Japanese artists are interested in this product, and they start making proto-pop art even before American artists do. And they come to the United States. The most famous one is Yoko Ono, but there's quite a lot of them, and they have a big influence on the American avant-garde. So I wanted to write a chapter on that. I did not. Just ran out of gas. But yeah, sure, there's lots of stuff that's left out. But you'd want to think that the reader interested in those things would find a way to think about them in the way that I think about the things I do write about.
Hovering over this immense project is your particular sensibility, which gives the book consistency, despite the fabulous variety in it.
And what is that?
I'll tell you.
Okay.
I've done my research, you see. In bin 32, I found a comment from David Bromwich that said that you have a critical stance that is described as suitably unimpressed.
Yeah.
In other words, nobody seems to command your total admiration. On the other hand, you don't really condemn anything outright. Is this just a kind of professional stance, or do you find that you're constitutionally unwilling to engage in hero worship or total trashing?
That's not my job. My job isn't to approve and disapprove. My job
Are
is
you suitably unimpressed? Is that a fair description of
No,
your...
that's stupid. I'm unimpressed by Jackson Pollock. I just talked about Did I seem unimpressed by Jackson Pollock?
It was David Bromwich, it was not me.
Okay, that's fine. But no, I'm not unimpressed. It's just, my job is not to tell the reader, you should like this and don't like that. My job is to tell the reader, this is what it is. This is what happened. This is what the person was trying to do. This is what it looked like. That's my job. My job isn't to tell you whether you should approve of it or not. That's not what hit stories should be doing.
Right.
Put it a different way. Of course I have tastes, I have preferences, just like everybody else, but my preferences are more interesting than anybody else's, right? So I don't want to tell you, I like this kind of music. Who cares? That's not important.
You begin, as you mentioned, with George Kennan, whose long memo laid out what would become the lines of force and what would become the Cold War.
Right.
And then at the end of the book, Kennan appears again before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee in 1966, and he's talking about the strategy of containment.
Right.
And you say, at this moment, American intellectuals and the public is already beginning to sense danger here.
Yeah.
And we're about to make a terrible mistake in Vietnam, I think is the implication of this.
Yeah.
And I wonder if there's an argument here that you don't quite make, which is that the effort led by the State Department and the Department of Defense to spread democracy around the world was not only on the brink of a tragic mistake, but it was kind of unnecessary because the cultural products of America, the music and the movies and everything like, were doing a far better job of selling democracy than the State Department with all its radio programs and programs abroad ever could.
Yeah.
So in a sense, it was a tragic and unnecessary attempt to sell the world on democracy by military means.
Yeah, I mean, it was a tragedy for lots of other reasons too, obviously, in Vietnam. I think we misunderstood what that war was all about. It was a war of independence. It happened that the independence fighters were communists, and they were real communists, but we didn't get that we couldn't really play a role there in that society. But yeah, Geoffrey's right too, that there was a lot of cultural diplomacy after 1945, particularly after 1950 when the CIA gets started up. And the State Department, with sending performers like Louis Armstrong abroad, and then the CIA with funding various organizations, mostly political, but some cultural, helping to promote American culture abroad. And the culture that tended to be promoted was fine art, painting, and highbrow stuff like Lionel Trilling's criticism and things like that. So the idea was, on the part of the government agencies, that we wanted to show the world that we're sophisticated. So we sent our most sophisticated products abroad. And of course, what people liked is Elvis Presley, Hollywood movies, jazz, American clothes. And that's what in a way, conquered the world. But Vietnam, I feel the Vietnam thing is complicated because I think what happens is, after 1945, this is what 1984 is all about, is that people start thinking totalitarianism is a disease anybody can catch. And because Orwell's image of the future is every society will be totalitarian, the whole world will be totalitarian in the future. Remember, there's 3 super states who are all totalitarian, just like each other, fighting all the time. So people thought this is a disease, and if we let it spread, it's like a contagion, it will go everywhere. And people really thought that was happening in Vietnam. They didn't see it as one country fighting for its liberation from colonialism, French colonialism. They saw it as a kind of area thing where all these countries in Southeast Asia would get infected by this terrible disease. So that's part of what drove American policy at that point, and that turned out to be a huge mistake.
The Cold War dragged on until 1989, but your title says The Free World, Art and Thought in the Cold War, but it ends well before that.
Sure. Yeah.
Which suggests that you've got another tome.
No way, yeah. Yeah.
There's another tome's worth of material.
There is another tone's worth, but it's not as fun. Yeah, well, I think when scholars write about the Cold War from a cultural point of view, there's a lot of books on Cold War theater, Cold War dance, so on. They're really talking about the first 20 years because that's the period when the engines of cultural diplomacy are working that we just were talking about. After that, it's mostly an arms race after 1965. So the cultural piece becomes much less important and therefore less interesting to a cultural historian like me.
Let's talk a little bit, very briefly, about a cultural historian like you. You criticize Isaiah Berlin's approach as books talking to books, right? In other words, you have these movements, and they interact with other movements, and the whole thing is conducted at a very high plane of abstraction. How would you describe your approach in contrast to his?
On the street, yeah. I want to be on the street. I want to be where people are bumping into people, and something happens because of that random encounter. I want to be where Jackson Pollock puts the canvas on the floor because he can't fit it on the wall. I want to be there. I don't want to be at the level of trying to describe works of art or works of literature as talking to each other. A lot of intellectual history is written that way. Intellectual historians generally aren't interested in biography at all because they're interested in the ideas. And they tend, I think, to mistakenly assume that when one writer reads another writer, they're reading that writer accurately. They never are. They're always misreading that writer, misunderstanding that writer. So a lot of transmission, cultural transmission, takes the form of misunderstanding or misprision or mistranslation. There's lots of examples of that in the book. So when you're talking just at the level of the text, you're missing all of that. You're not getting what the individuals are actually making of this thing that they're reading in order to produce something of their own.
Right, the impression you get of this book is one of massive contingency. In other words, if you think about movements like the abstract expressionist movement, it sounds like everybody had the same idea in their head, and they all went out and executed for the next 8 years or something like this. But what you talk about is a kind of social maelstrom in which people bump into other people and they either form a phobic reaction or they react against them in some way. I was particularly fascinated by the adventures. He's not actually a very interesting man, actually. You mentioned him earlier, Claude Lévi-Strauss, the anthropologist, but he got involved in some unbelievable things. Like he was living in the same 11th Avenue building as Claude Shannon, who was the inventor of information theory. He was sitting next to the anthropologist Franz Boas when he had his fatal heart attack.
Columbia Faculty Club. That's a little too neat.
And multiply that times 1,000, and you have the sense of reading this book. You know, it's like seeing a rock and flipping over the rock and seeing this massive swarm of insect life, everybody running in every different direction.
Yeah, but they produce these amazing things. It's not just a swarm of insects because he produces social anthropology. Or Andy Warhol produces pop art, or they produce incredible things, and it comes out of they're just people like us. They're smarter than us, but they're just people like us, and they have something they want to do. They have to figure out a way to make it happen. All Jackson Pollock wants to do is make a painting. He doesn't care about what our art history wants to say about it, and we're all that way. Look, my field is literary studies. Do I know where the paradigm is going in literary studies? I have no idea. I don't know anybody who has any idea. We just try to write criticism, and I think that's what I'm trying to get. I'm trying to describe it that way.
I'll ask one more question, then I'll invite questions from the audience. I hope there are many and pointed. I'd like you to talk, if you could, a little bit. What?
Pointed?
Blunted?
Okay.
I hope they're polite. I'd like you to talk just a little bit, because I found it so fascinating in your book, the figure of James Baldwin, who actually has a Paris life, and then or a France life at least, and then he has an American life with a couple different phases in it. Could you just talk a little bit about the cultural figure that James Baldwin was?
Yeah, so as I say, I tried to get to know my characters, and he was the hardest person to get to know, pretty much. Very complicated man, fascinating figure, and the way he thought was hard for me to get for a long time, because it's not the way I think.
A very haunted figure.
Huh?
Haunted.
Yeah, I mean, he's a complicated person, and a complicated story. So anyway, what Geoffrey was mentioning was that Baldwin went to France in 1948 to exile himself because he's very young then, he's probably 20, and he was suffering from racial discrimination and also homophobia in the United States, and he wanted to get out. So he went to Paris, and he lived there for 9 years. He doesn't go back to the United States permanently until 1957, and writes his first 3 books there. While he's there, France is taking part of what is really the big story in this period, which is decolonization. Between 1945 and 1970, almost all the former European colonies become independent sovereign states governed by non-white peoples. That's a huge change in the international map. And he's in Paris while this is going on because France is engaged in 2 colonial wars, one in Indochina, which becomes the war in Vietnam for us, and the other in Algeria. So all European French intellectuals are talking about decolonization, and a lot of black former colonial subjects of France are coming to Paris talking about it as well. And Baldwin's privy to all these conversations. So when he comes back to the United States in 1957, which is about a year after the success of the Montgomery bus boycott, he meets King. He admires King very much because Baldwin had been a boy preacher in Harlem, and his father had been a preacher in Harlem, and he didn't trust black preachers, but he trusted King. He thought King was a great man, and he becomes associated with King in the Civil Rights Movement. He becomes a spokesman for the Civil Rights Movement, and I'll describe what happens to that in a second. But what's important, I think, is that he is able to see the Civil Rights Movement in the context of this global phenomenon of decolonization. Most Americans, even today when you talk about the Civil Rights Movement with Americans, they only think about it in terms of American history. They don't really think about it in terms of international history, but Europeans saw it, the Civil Rights Movement, as part of the decolonization movement. So blacks from West Africa or from Martinique or other former European colonies want to express solidarity with American blacks, and American blacks are resistant to that because they feel their story is different. So Baldwin's privy to all that. So he's got a very sophisticated understanding of what's going on here. And then he becomes this very celebrity figure. In 1962, he publishes his 3rd novel, which is called Another Country, becomes a bestseller. And then in 1963, he publishes The Fire Next Time, which is the book we all know. And that also becomes a bestseller. He's pasted on the cover of Time magazine and so on. And then there's a white backlash among liberals against Baldwin. So the very first issue of the New York Review of Books, the very first piece in the magazine is an attack on The Fire Next Time. And he's attacked by Susan Sontag, he's attacked by Hannah Arendt, he's attacked by all these liberals. Why is that? Because Baldwin's message was white liberals have to take responsibility for the regime of white supremacy, just like all other white people. They're no different. They're benefiting from this regime, and they have to acknowledge that. White liberals don't want to hear that. They don't want to think that they have anything to do with racial apartheid. Baldwin's saying, even if you don't think you do, you do. You should confess that. Something's wrong with white culture in America. That's what the problem is. People didn't want to hear that in 1963, 1964. So his books start getting bad reviews. He leaves America, moves to France, lives in the south of France for most of the rest of his life, and Turkey, where he has friends. And he's very marginalized. In 1962, Skip Gates, Henry Louis Gates Jr., was a writer for Time magazine, and he goes to 1972 to Baldwin's house in France to interview him for a piece. He sends it into Time, and they say, we're not interested in Baldwin, he's passé. It's 1972. So then he comes back. Why does he come back? Because Black Lives Matter and Ta-Nehisi Coates say to white people, you have to own your role in the regime of white supremacy. That's exactly what Baldwin had been saying 50 years before.
Okay. Well, I think you got the impression of really a remarkable undertaking.
Thank you.
And now we'll take some polite questions from the audience, if there are any. I can't see very well.
Can we
so
raise the
perhaps
house lights? Is that possible?
I see. Yeah. Thank you.
Can we turn up the house lights, or was that?
Yeah.
That's up? Okay.
So probably in the early 90s, I heard a speech by Colin Howell, and he called the period that you write about the Cold War, but he said, at some point, we're going to think about it as the long peace. And I'm wondering whether that peaceful background, what role you feel it played in the rich cultural discussions that you have.
Yeah, that's a good point. It was not peaceful in Vietnam, right, or Korea, but it was peaceful in the Western democracies after this horrendous war that everybody had been through. And that did give people the feeling that peace and prosperity had finally arrived. I think it made artists in particular feeling they were able to be more creative. One thing about the period, in addition to all the other ways we've been characterizing it, between 1950 and 1973, the income gap and the wealth gaps between the top earners and the middle class was the smallest in world history. So there was, the top earners owned less percentage of the total national wealth than they do now or they did before the war. It was also a period of record economic growth around the world. World growth rates averaged in this period, 1950 to 73, 4.9%. So we can't imagine that today. And this was everywhere. This was in South America, this was in China, this was in the Warsaw Pact countries as well as in the democracies. So the feeling was that the pie was just going to keep growing. The annual growth rate, GDP, in Japan in the 1960s was 11%. That's nobody's ever approached that before. So it's very different from our world where we have this huge income gap and this a huge class stratification that everybody's concerned about. They didn't have that for the first time then, for lots of reasons. So the combination of those things, peace and prosperity, economic growth, the feeling the pie's going to grow forever, encourages people to take chances because there's sort of a social safety net, as it were. You know, you're not going to fall too far. And I think that's part of the reason why it's so interesting to write about. Thank you.
Next question. Fine? Yes? Would you stand up, please? There you are.
Thank you. I can't wait to read this book. Thank you. My father, interestingly enough, was the public affairs officer in India in 1957 for the United States Information Agency, and he brought the Dave Brubeck Quartet to India as part of this cultural persuasion that you've been talking about. And then later, he created a show called Music USA with a fellow called Willis Conover, which shortwaved jazz behind the Iron Curtain and was the most listened to broadcast, foreign broadcast, for several years behind the Iron Curtain. Do you get into any of these government programs that did try to export American culture abroad?
I don't write too much about that, no. There are several really good books about the American cultural diplomacy in this period. Some emphasize the role the CIA played, which I think is exaggerated in a lot of these books, but some talk about State Department and USIA and other agencies and what they did. So I don't do too much of that in the book because I don't do too much with government-related stuff in the book. But it's very important because you have to keep in mind that the people who the American government is trying to persuade of the benefits of the American way of life are the elites. They're the opinion leaders. That's why Sartre's important, because people listen to him. He's thought of as an authority. They're less interested in what the average public thinks in these countries, because that's not going to change opinion. They're trying to change opinion at the elite level. So that's why Dave Brubeck is appropriate, and that's why modernist poetry is appropriate. But there's a story that when Allen Ginsberg went to Prague in 1963, this is of course at the height of the Cold War, he went to a cafe in Prague, and on the wall there was a picture of Allen Ginsberg. So the beat writers were very influential, particularly in Czechoslovakia, even during the Cold War, because they managed to get it behind the Iron Curtain, and it had a big influence on Czech writers. So there's lots of cases where it's effective. There's lots of cases where it probably didn't make a huge amount of difference.
Yes, over here. Oh, one up here? Okay, since I see less well than you, why don't you just designate?
Okay.
Can we get a microphone up there then?
I have a microphone. I was curious about the female figures in the book. Or
The female figures in the book.
You want me to name them, or? Oh, yes, there are. Yeah. So there's a chapter on Hannah Arendt and the origins of totalitarianism. And then there's a chapter on the women's movement, which begins with Betty Friedan and talks about the influence that Simone de Beauvoir's book, The Second Sex, had on the feminine mystique, which Friedan herself tended to minimize, but I was able to look at all the notes that she took I believe it's box 13, file 6, of the Friedan papers, took the notes that she took on when she read The Second Sex. And then I talk about the role that women had in public life, which was basically zero. 1963, which is when The Feminine Mystique was written, 95% of doctors were men, 95% of lawyers were men, 80% of college professors were men. There have been, I think, 2 women ambassadors in entire American history. There was just no women in public life. And even in the arts, women's work was disparaged. So there were many important abstract painters in the 40s and 50s, like, Lee Krasner, whose work was ignored by the museums and by the public, and by critics. So there's an enormous amount of sexism in the period. And I document that in 2 ways. I talk about comic books. So everybody knows, I think, there was a kind of comic book inquisition in 1954 when a Senate committee investigated the effects of comic books on kids. It was producing juvenile delinquency. And it resulted actually in a code of comic books that comic books had to adhere to, which was very strict about what they could show. And I talk about a lot of the images in these pre-code comic books, and they're almost all involving violence against women. Women are tortured, they're whipped, their heads are cut off. It's amazing how it proliferates. And the people who led the campaign against comic books kept saying to the Senate and to the public, look at what these books are teaching kids, particularly little boys, about women. And then I look at the popular fiction of the period, the pulp fiction or mass market fiction. The covers of those books almost all show women being shot or women in kind of negligee with a gun. They're all about violence against women. And then I tell the story of Norman Mailer, who in 1960 stabbed his wife at a party, almost killed her, pierced the pericardium around her heart. She was taken to the hospital, was in 4 hours of surgery to save her life. He gets off with nothing, basically, after a year of sort of legal proceedings. And then he writes a novel in 1965 called An American Dream. And in the novel, the hero of the novel kills his wife, throws her body out the window, and then has sex with her maid, in case you missed the point that killing women is a turn-on. And he publishes this book. It's reviewed everywhere. Nobody mentions that this book about a man who kills his wife and gets away with it was written by a man who almost killed his wife and got away with it. That's the situation in 1963. So I show that.
Okay. I know there's some more. We have time for 1 or 2 more. Over here. We'll try to get you here.
First, thanks for a erudite and entertaining discussion. As I listened, I was thinking about fashion. Geoffrey, you're impeccably dressed as an ambassador would be in the 50s, and Louis, you look like a beat writer. And would you comment on fashion and how it played into this period of time? And the second quick question, what kind of shoes are you wearing? They're really cool.
I assume you're talking about his, not mine.
My wife could tell you what they are. They're Allbirds, yeah, thank you, yeah. This is a very expensive shirt.
It's not all that clean, but it's very expensive.
It's clean. So what was the question? Was there a question? Oh, the fashion play, yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, I don't have a good answer to that. Yeah, that's a good question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Where is the microphone now? There you go. This woman right here? Yeah.
So I'm curious, you ended the book with Vietnam War,
Yeah.
but within 2 or 3 years, well, there are 2 things going on. One, John Hope Franklin, who's an African-American historian, had begun writing basically a history that started in 1947. He wrote his first volume of History of the African-American.
From slavery to freedom.
Which is an interesting kind of, that the history was sort of being parallel written, and in a way, your book seems to parallel write that.
Yeah.
But in 1966, there were 2 books on architecture. One was called The Architecture of the City by Aldo Rossi, published in Italy, very influential, where basically the turn of art and culture was urban in its tenets. And in this country, Robert Venturi wrote Complexity and Contradiction in Architecture, which essentially kind of paved the way for a kind of commodification or corporation of art and culture in this country since that time, both architecturally and in a lot of ways. And I'm curious if that endpoint may be short-circuited. For instance, African-American rule until '68, and then the idea of architecture playing a role in that sort of cultural event. There's an interesting book, a Viennese exhibit in the last couple of years about how Vienna was partitioned just like Berlin, but they did architectural, city planning kinds of things in different parts of Vienna after World War II. So just a couple of thoughts.
Yeah, thank you. Those are all good thoughts. And obviously, 1965 is not a firewall. Things keep going. And one thing about trying to write this kind of history is that different art forms sort of develop at different speeds. So it's not like everybody's doing roughly similar things at similar moments. So architecture is one area where a lot of interesting stuff happens after 1965. You've mentioned some of it. I would mention Learning from Las Vegas as well, which kind of introduces what I would call postmodernism into architecture. That's 1972, I think. And also in fiction. So fiction, poetry gets very absorbed with what is poetry, but fiction doesn't really do that until the 70s or late 60s. And then fiction gets metafictional, and it sort of engages in the same way with its own medium in the way that painting and music have been doing before that. So for sure, there's a lot of stuff that I didn't take account of. I'm not sure what you meant about John Hope Franklin. I do have a chapter on the Civil Rights Movement as part of my Baldwin discussion and about race relations. But yeah, sure, there's a lot of stuff that continues.
Well, it's a book that stimulates endless conversation. We've run out of time for this event, but Luke will be signing books downstairs, so join us down there. And thanks very much for coming.
Thank you.